Race relations, and specifically, we're going to be looking at Lynch law here. And as such, I do want to give you a warning that there is graphic content within this video. So when we're looking at the time period of like 1877, which is the end of Reconstruction, through about 1890, all the way to maybe 1900-ish, it's kind of a blurry line here, race relations during this time period really remained remarkably fluid in the South. Federal troops technically had left, but a lot of times Black people were able to continue to vote and even hold office. And you even see the Democratic Party would court the Black electorate at times and in certain places. That being said, segregation is still going to rule when it comes to like churches, and a lot of like schools and stuff, but you do even see some organizations at this time period and public places tended to actually mingle when it came to races. A lot of times they did business together and had to thus maintain cordial relations. You can see in this quote a Black journalist from New York describing his experience with passengers on a train when he is going from Washington, D.C. into the South. So he enters the train and he says, "I had a chip on my shoulder, daring any man to knock it off." So it very much was ready. But then he observes the whites of the South are really less afraid to have contact with colored people than the whites of the North. I can ride in first-class cars. I can go into saloons and get refreshments, even as in New York. I can stop in and drink a glass of soda and be more politely waited upon than in some parts of New England. And that's the thing is, oftentimes Black people were actually surprised at how cordial relations and conversations with white people could actually be in the South. Like I said before, there was interracial groups such as labor unions. A lot of times Black people could continue to be really involved in the Republican Party. They might engage in business together, hunt, fish together, work side by side. And a lot of this especially is going to be the case in cities where you're going to see really races commingle together, quite frankly, in cities a lot. Now, that being said, even in this time period, Black people are still going to face discrimination, especially when it comes to things like employment, voting, and just random retaliation for perceived violations of racial barriers. Then we get to the 1890s a bit more. The thing is, Black people, the Black generation really, who comes of age during Reconstruction and the time period after Reconstruction, really want to have, understandably so, full participation in American society. The problem is, white people that came of age at the same time were really bothered by the idea of Black people being seen as their equal. They had been raised on the whole mythos of the lost cause and that, oh, the Civil War wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights. Never mind, it was about states' rights to have slavery. Anyway, and so the white people that come of age during this time period had basically been raised on this myth of the lost cause. They were constantly reminded of the heroism and sacrifice of their fathers during the Civil War. And so in their mind, no longer are the Yankees the enemy, but Black people are now the enemy. And so this new generation of white people really felt this need to preserve white purity. And more important than that, they felt like they had to preserve white dominance, white supremacy. And so obviously you're going to get tensions between these two viewpoints. And these are going to be exacerbated because you have a deteriorating rural economy during the late 1880s and the early 1890s. So that's where we're coming into this 1890s more so. Things are kind of changing a little bit. Plus, you combine some volatile politics of this time, and then like the growth of the cities in the South doesn't help matters either, because this is going to put the two races in close contact with each other, specifically competing against each other for jobs. So in the 1890s, we're seeing a lot more racist rhetoric, and violence against Black people just really accelerates. And this is when you get the concept of Lynch law, as you can see pictured here. So Lynch law wasn't an actual law. It was a perceived law of the South during this time period that basically said that there were unspoken rules, and these were rules that white Southerners basically imposed on Black Southerners to maintain racial barriers and to maintain white supremacy. So there's two big rules here. The first rule a Black person should not break was you cannot prosper. And the second rule was you cannot challenge white authority. Now the thing is if a Black person broke one of these rules, they violated one of these rules of prospering or just challenging white authority, oftentimes this meant their death through lynching. Which, by the way, lynching typically, as you've seen in this, is the hanging of Black people until they are dead. But it didn't necessarily have to be hanging. When we're talking about Lynch law and killing Black people for just prospering or challenging white authority, that was all they had done. If white people went on to kill them, that's considered lynching them on some level. So kind of keep that in mind. Giving you an example of how bad it was numerically. In 1892, a year of particular political agitation as well as an economic depression, 235 lynchings occurred in the South. If you look at the time period between 1882 and 1903, 2,000 Black Southerners were lynched. The thing is, the lynchers, the people who carried out these grisly crimes, typically were working class white people. A lot of times they had rural roots and they were struggling in a depressed economy and basically needed someone to blame. And therefore, they were enraged at the fluidity of urban race relations and would strike out at Black people who they see as prospering or challenging white authority. And it could be as simple as, oh, there's a Black grocery store across the street from a white grocery store, and the Black grocery store is being perceived to be doing better than the white grocery store. And suddenly the owners of that grocery store that were Black are going to be lynched. And yes, things like that happened. The thing is, white leaders in the South generally were silent when it came to the issue of lynching Black individuals, which really, this silence gave their acceptance of this violence, because it was all, once again, about white solidarity. Very few leaders in the South spoke out against lynching, but a lot of times if they spoke out against lynching, they would tack on statements to the end such as, unless assaults by Negroes on white women and little girls come to an end, there will most probably still be further displays of vengeance that will shock the world. So in other words, they blamed Black people, saying, oh, white people were just trying to end some sort of rape epidemic. And that's the thing. This idea that Black men specifically were going out and raping white women wasn't true. But it's very clear that this was really one of the most common justifications white people gave for lynching black men during this time period, even though only 25% of lynchings even had an alleged sexual connotation or connection at all. And I say alleged. So it's clear lynchers weren't actually doing this to end some sort of rape epidemic. No. These white people who lynched black people were doing this to try to keep black people in their so-called place and to restore their own sense of manhood and honor. And the really unfortunate thing about this, besides just even the death, it really was the case that the more black people succeeded, the greater the risk to their own life. Also, it's really striking about these lynchings of this time period, looking at really more the 1890s, but you saw like it starts as early as the 1880s and it goes through like 1900 everything. What's really striking is you have this like orchestrated cruelty and the involvement of really large groups within the white community. It's a spectacle of horror. You can't look away from it. I mean, the fact that we have this picture and the last picture tells you something. It's a collective cleansing of sin by killing the so-called sinner in the most gruesome possible manner, in the most horrific way. You can see men, women, children all gathering together. And in this way, it was once again white people trying to elevate white men as, oh, they're supposed to be the protector of the weak white women and children. And once again, it's reinforcing those ideas of white solidarity and reiterating that white supremacy ruled the South with impunity during this time period. So, looking at these two pictures, I want you to look at them really closely. I know they're very uncomfortable to look at. What do you notice about them?